Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, welcome to our last session for the day in the Resilient Society track. It's called Lift Kara De. The aim of the session is to peep into the thinking that drives funders in this space, as well as to understand the objectives and aspirations behind funding citizenship. What spurs and limits certain types of funding from taking place? What have been the challenges and learnings? How can more funding be catalyzed for the sector? These are some of the themes that we will be exploring. Before we begin, a few housekeeping rules for the audience. There are two windows or tabs to your right. The chat window for conversation on topics being discussed. We encourage you to let us know your thoughts throughout the session. And a Q&A window for asking any questions that you may have. Ask your questions throughout the session and note that the questions can be upvoted as well. We hope to run the session for 50 minutes, and in the last 10 minutes, we will try to answer the most upvoted questions by directing them towards the speaker. With that, let me hand this over to Tarun Cherukuri, co-founder and CEO of Intersection, to introduce our speakers and take this session forward. Over to you, Tarun.
Thank you, Yash. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tarun from Intersection, like Yash said. To get us started, I'll quote Aaron Sorkin from West Wing, where he famously said, "Decisions in a democracy are taken by people who decide to show up." So that's really apt for today's discussion. We'll deep dive into funders' perspective on the practice of active citizenship, a key enabling factor to actually make that happen, mobilize more citizens to show up in the public sphere. We have a really strong panel to enable this discussion. We have three represent senior leadership from three pioneering foundations in the space of active citizenship. Natasha Joshi from Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, Sameer Shishodia from the Inmatter Foundation, and Bharat Pandey from Omidyar Network Investments. All three who've kind of led the way by investing philanthropic risk capital in not just active citizenship, but fledgling and underserved fields like digital societies, gender equity, and climate resilience. With that, first of all, we'll start with a short poll to understand what all of you would love to hear from our three speakers. Yash, if you could help me with the short poll. So we have four themes for today that we'd focus the discussion on. So we'd like to hear what you would like to hear. The first theme on growing the pie of funds for active citizenship. The second theme, exploring the funder-founder power dynamics. The session before this was focused on founders, and this will focus on funders. So we'd like to kind of delve into the dynamics between the both. Thirdly, the levers of impact in active citizenship space, technology, measuring success, ecosystem partnerships. And the final theme, how do we imagine India at 100 in 2047, especially in the realm of active citizenship. Take 30 seconds more to Thank you, everyone. We'll pause the voting there. Yes, is it possible to show kind of the percentages once again very quickly? So we have majority of you interested in increasing the pie for active citizenship. The next, in terms of talking about future of active citizenship, when India turns 100 in 2047. Interestingly, no interest for funder-founder power dynamics. So maybe like if we have some space, we'll try and squeeze that in as well. But having said that, I'll turn this over to the speakers now to give their opening remarks. For those of you interested in their profiles, their brief bios are in the chat window for you to read more. We'll go in alphabetical order, so I'll open the floor to Natasha for her opening remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Tarun. And this is actually a conversation that we've had many times internally, and it's really lovely to have this externally as well. For at Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, our work in active citizenship is something that we call as a portfolio, but it's really such a horizontal and it kind of overlaps with all of our other portfolios that it's difficult to sort of give it a very clear contour of what falls under civil society, what falls under citizenship, what falls under justice, because all of these things are inextricably linked. But I think that, the genesis naturally of a lot of the work comes from this faith in sort of Samaj being the first sector, Samaj being the sort of container within which all of the other interactions between the players happen. And therefore, the voice, platforming the voice of citizens, platforming the interactions between citizens is something that we feel very passionately about. At the same time, I think it's also a very hard to define category of work, because many times when we talk about citizen itself as a word can be unpacked in many different ways, sometimes excitingly, sometimes problematically. So we have to contend with many of these ideas, and I think that we're very excited to do this in a co-creative manner rather than to just sort of think of it entirely on our own. So I'm just sort of going to keep that short because I'm actually quite excited to talk to all three of you and dialogue a lot more than just sort of share my own thinking. So I'd love to pass this on to Samir, perhaps.
Hey, thanks, Natasha. So I think you said it absolutely right. It's very difficult to disengage citizenship, citizenry from any aspect of any of the work we're doing, right? In fact, a major focus, if you have to try and solve climate change, and that's our focus as a foundation. We are fairly new to this. We do not have that much experience in the civil society space, but we just looked at it as a bunch of problems that needed to be solved, and you just cannot keep the citizen out of it, right? You cannot keep solving in silos. So unless a lot of these ideas, solutions, attempts go mainstream, I don't think we are solving any of this. So in fact, I would turn it around and say, that's at the root of everything that we need to solve. So that's how we're looking at it.
Thank you, Samir. Varun, do you want to come in?
Okay, sure. No, great to be here. Thanks, Tarun. Thanks, Samir and Natasha and RNP for organizing this session. If you give me a couple of minutes, I actually just wanted to tee up a few thoughts around, maybe anchor this discussion a little bit in the historical context. Because I think if you think about the head, especially India at 1947, I think it's useful to learn from the past just a little bit. And I've been fortunate to have seen this issue closely, both within government as a developer practitioner and as a philanthropic organization that has been engaging in governance and citizen engagement for about 10 years in India. So, the first interesting thing in my view is that civic engagement, active citizenship was a constitutional function. And, those of us who read the constitutional debates, the whole issue of Panchayati Raj was very core to it. Where the founding fathers landed there was to say it will be a directive principle of state policy. Essentially meant it's not a justiciable part of the constitution, but it's an aspiration for the new state. And then, as many of you know, in 1992, when we got the 73rd, 74th Amendment to the Constitution, we were able to activate these both the urban and the rural aspects of civic engagement by instituting a 3-tier system of government, of local governance, by ensuring that the Gram Sabha, at least in theory, is really going to be the heart of all decision making, bottom-up decision making by citizens, and by devolving functions to the PRIs, Panchayati Raj institutions, and the ULBs, the urban local bodies. Now, what happened there, right? I think interesting learning for us from that is that when you think about active citizenship bottom-up, there are 3 Fs. There's functions, there's functionaries, and there are funds. Now, what the 73rd and 74th Amendment did really well was to devolve functions to the local bodies. However, I would argue that they largely failed in the other 2 Fs, which is devolving functionaries, the people who are supposed to deliver services, their accountability to citizens, And even more importantly and relevant to this conversation, funds. We all know the state of our open local bodies and panchayats in terms of their own sources of funding, their lack of discretionary powers in making funding decisions. And to be honest, I think many of these institutions at the grassroots have become more glorified implementers of top-down agendas. So I think it's fact number one. I think the Constitution gave us a civic engagement pocket, including the funding for it. We haven't been able to implement it. The second vignette, I would say, is civic engagement through community mobilization, which has been the other big thing in the last 30, 40 years in our country. We've had the cooperative movement, mixed bag, lots of people have lots of views on it. The one movement I have closely observed and I wanted to tee up for this discussion is the women's self-help group movement. Because I think that's almost, in my view, a silent revolution over the last 20 years in this country. More than 80 million women in rural India are part of women's self-help groups. I had the privilege of seeing them from close quarters, seeing the before and after effect, and many of you may have also seen it. I think the incredible thing here has been that it has tried to address the issue of civic empowerment at three levels. The first is the very basic, which is saving and thrift, followed by low-cost credit for basic livelihood activities. The second is around taking ownership of service delivery in their local context. So the well-functioning SHGs have been doing everything from local procurement of agriculture to running PDS shops and so on and so forth. And of course, the highest level effect is the empowerment effect, the confidence, the passion, the belief that comes if you're part of an effective SHG. The magic, in my view, of the SHG movement has been the federated structure, which is to say there will be a support system to these grassroots community organizations. And at every higher level, the complexity will go up, right? So while the basic ownership is with the unit of the self-help group, they are provided the support structure to actually become successful, whether it's market linkages, whether it's access to technology, whether it is coordination with the state machinery and so on and so forth. And I think that is a really interesting learning as you think about funding citizen engagement, that identifying the right leverage points for that funding is very important. And I would argue the SHG movement is an exemplar in the Indian context for that purpose. And lastly, I think the third example I would give are community mobilization and civic engagement through special purpose missions which have happened in our country. We're all familiar with the Swachh Bharat mission, got a lot of publicity over the last 5 years. But an interesting precursor to the Swachh Bharat mission was a program that some of you may have heard of called the Nirmal Gram Puraskar. And the idea here was that we let the community take ownership to make the village open defecation free. And if it does achieve that task, then a financial reward will be given to the village to invest in a public work of their choice. And so the interesting thing here was a conditional outcome-based incentive, which was given to the community to come together. And I think there were many studies around the Nirmal Gram Puraskar back in 2011 to 2014, which suggested that this was an interesting concept. And so the fact number 3 for me was, when we think about funding citizen engagement and active citizenship, finding the right mechanism to overcome the collective action problem, which is endemic when we talk about civic engagement, is really critical, and funding can play an important role in this. So I just wanted to start, Tarun, by placing these 3, I would say, historical examples of active citizenship. One, starting with the Constitution itself, which tried to do this, community mobilization through the self-help group movement, and then special purpose efforts such as Swachh Bharat and the Nirmal Gram Puraskar, which are giving us some really interesting learnings from the past on the role of funding and how and where to deploy it. Over to you.
Thank you, Varad, for kind of setting up this discussion in the historical context, and Ms. Samir and Natasha as well for kind of adding texture to kind of the definition of the space itself. I think one thing that comes to mind is building on what all 3 of you said, is the size of the space itself. Like Varad kind of extended the definition to include SHGs and special purpose missions as well. I kind of read benchmarking of the number of public servants involved in India relative to other countries. And what I picked up was that we're right now, even if we include PSU employees, and I'm not sure if SCGs are included in this calculation, but it amounts to about 3.5 to 4% of our entire capita that is involved in public serving roles as part of the government, benchmark with kind of Western countries and developed countries. So they're at about 12 to 15%. So we don't have accurate stats on number of active citizens or number of kind of active civil society organizations and SHGs. But kind of rough estimates indicate that probably it amounts to 1-2 CR, up and above the 4 CR public servants. So clearly, like there is an order of 3 to 4 times, I guess, under commitment of resources at the level of either functionaries or at the level of broad size of the participation itself. So I'm curious to learn how you're thinking about leverage from kind of each of your foundational vantage points. How do we grow the size of this pie? How do we bring, of course, more funds into kind of high leverage spaces like Bharat listed out? And deriving from the funds, like, how do we motivate kind of increased number of functionaries, both from civil society, but also how do we motivate the state to spend more on, some of these, high leverage initiatives? I'll open the floor. Any of you can get us started. But I'd like all of you to kind of share your views on this question.
Okay, go ahead, Samir.
Yeah. So actually, Bharat, thanks a lot. You provided a nice framework for bringing out a lot of points that we've been thinking about. We've obviously not. We've been thinking about everything from a very strong climate lens, obviously, and for us, it's not a function of choice, because I don't think, like I said earlier, I don't think we can solve this problem by just the government or a few people focusing on it, or a few. So for us, it's a problem that's to be solved multidimensionally across sectors, across whatever people are doing. It doesn't matter if they're solving healthcare or education; they have to account for the ecology. Otherwise, it's going to be a short-lived solution. Let me just put it very bluntly like that, right? And this again has to find adoption ground up, right? Right from the large base of citizenry in any bioregion that you're trying to address this in. To the institutions and the markets there, right? So there's a whole, like you said, there's a hierarchy of players, not just in the SHGs and not just in government, but in society as a whole. Like Samaj itself is a complex beast, right? Like, and it actually subsumes pretty much everything else we do. So the belief around some of these ideas, the recognition of especially the nth order problems that arise out of it, because the benefits are also, we're starting to, the nth order problems are starting to become a very here and now thing right now, as far as climate's concerned. But the benefits are still nth order, and it's a complex one to message, right? I think collective action fails there, because the impact from it is not always immediate, and we've seen it in multiple partners that we have tried to, we try to understand if so much effort has gone into it, if so many experiments have happened, why hasn't it added up to something? And as part of this is something that we learned from their experiences, that unless there's a grounding in society, unless there's a grounding in what people believe, what people understand, I don't think we're going to make progress. So functionaries for us start from that large citizenry to people who are trying to solve that problem at whether institutionally or as entrepreneurs. So it'll need multiple people to play these roles. The functions have to cut across, at least from a climate lens, they just have to cut across, civil society functions, government roles, market roles, all of that. So we can't cherry pick this. We can't solve the problem in one little domain and expect it to not get sucked back into the older normal, as it were. That's the phrase people use a lot. The funds are available. I think philanthropy can go a certain way to unlock. Once a large set of citizens believe something in a specific area, things tend to happen. Whether we've seen instances where people have pitched in their own money to replant mangroves that got destroyed because they realized that their survival is linked to it. Even if government funding or philanthropic funding did not appear for that. So I think funds are not the big problem. You can use it to unlock certain behaviors and whatever, and larger government funding, larger institutional funding. But I think the messaging change, trying to understand the benefit that comes from collective action, etc., is a very, very big missing piece. Natasha, sorry, I interrupted
No,
you.
that's fine. Actually, it's really interesting. I think there is something I wanted to pick up from what Bharat said, and then there's something that Samir said really struck me. So I think the women's SHG movement is a really interesting example of locating a solution, so to speak, within the social cultural realities of the people who are part of that solution. And that's one of the big things that I think one has to be very cognizant of, is that even if you're looking at any individual or groups of individuals, and whether you are looking to empower them or whether you're looking to have them express their voices, first just having a really strong sense of their lived realities becomes vital, to sort of understanding what it is they need, what it is that they can do, what are their and of course many times we kind of approach, there is a tendency to sort of look at especially marginalized groups with a sort of deficit lens, right? What is it they don't have? But then there are many aspects from which they can draw strength. And I think having a much better understanding of that is also really important. And I think I will be the first person to say that a lot of us may not have that. And so like developing better tools for listening and seeing some of those realities becomes really important. And so that's one. The other thing is, on missions, I think I really like this point because I used to work in education. I've worked there for a decade, and I think Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan is also a great example of sort of something that went to mission scale after it started as a sort of DFID, DPEP program in the kind of pre-mission stage, and even before that, all of the cluster level work was something that was much more grassroots and ground up, that came from departments and came from talukas on their own. So I think the question for us, and this is a really interesting question to ponder, is really that what is the arc of a solution or a movement? What is the arc of anything, and at what point does it become manifest versus at what point is it latently being nourished and brewing? And so for us, I think one of the areas that we always sort of try to understand is that, what is it that we can do at this point in time that will manifest, let's say 10 years later or 20 years later. With 20 years, I know it's quite long, especially on the climate thing. I think we need a much greater urgency. But even so, I think where we're trying to understand is what is the role of being able to demystify movements when they're embryonic, coming in at that point in time. And so in that regard, I think from a funding lens, in citizenship especially, or civic engagement, I think we're really excited about actions. Like for us, actions are the outcomes. Action taking, initiative taking, whether it is at the unit level. So whether that unit is an individual, or that unit is an organization, or the unit is a coalition of volunteers, whatever it is, just the very act of doing something is exciting. And I think of course there has to, what is valuable through conversations like the ones we're having is to sort of share ideas on how different people come with different lenses on understanding actions, and then how those actions can be coalesce into a greater whole and get greater momentum, and smaller coalitions can build into larger, and eventually, like I said, the movement or the solution emerges, as opposed to sort of us knowing that upfront. So that's some of the kind of reflections I had on what both Samir and Bharat said. And yeah, I'd like to sort of hear more from you as well, Tarun.
Tarun, can you hear me? Because there was a comment around I was not very audible.
Yeah, so if you could be closer to the mic, Bharat, okay. So it's in and out. So yeah.
I'll try that. Yeah. No, I'll just pick up from where Natasha left on this word demystify. I think I was thinking of this, and I think one of the challenges with active citizenship is the fact that the topic itself can seem a little esoteric and abstract, and not as compelling as direct causes like education and health, where you can see people's lives hopefully change in some very direct kind of way. So I think to me, the need to make the case, or make the social impact case in a compelling way is hard in this space, but also an area where we need to give a lot more thought. One, of course, is the standard technique of can we quantify the value in a way that is useful. And one of the things we do, for example, in our portfolio to Media Network India, we try and measure or at least capture the policy impact that the partner organization or investee has created. So, for example, Janagraha and the Foundation for Ecological Security, who are both our grantees investees, they track very nicely the kind of progress they have made on their agendas. And so we try and put it in a framework and for ourselves, and then aggregate it and use that to sort of actually grow the tribe in some way around those issues. The second, of course, is the idea of telling better stories of impact. I think, and Samir will relate to this, the climate change, which I hope is now finally at a tipping point in terms of both community interest and funding interest, has benefited from the whole making it real piece, starting from Al Gore's documentary to various efforts since then. And that, if anything, that has been far more powerful than IPCC reports in making the case for climate change. So telling better stories, I think, is sort of the second takeaway. And then I think the third is, I really believe that, outside funders can only do so much. The real leverage points are, one, the community, the second is the government, right? And we need to figure out ways of unlocking those in a more effective way. I think, finding the catalytic leverage points of government funding and figuring out how to make that happen in the interest of active citizenship is really important. I'll give you one example, which is there's an organization called iForest, which has recently been set up. One of the very interesting things they are working on is how do you create collective action among communities who are living in tribal areas to help unlock what are called district mineral funds, which are large pools of money, which are lying with districts which are in the tribal belt where mining happens and so on. So you have a large pool of government money which is not being unlocked, and they're trying to solve the problem how through community action we can unlock that money which is meant to be for communities. So I think finding that catalytic leverage point to unlock government resources is a huge underutilized lever as well that we should all try and help with.
Thank you all. I just wanted to kind of add a bit of my experience as well. I think largely building on the themes you had listed. So one, I agree with Samir that I think once you're able to demonstrate a critical mass of active citizen participation, so hopefully resources do follow, and that's been kind of our experience. Trying to mobilize resources for implementation of right to education and maternity benefits under right to food. And to Natasha's point, in fact, we've at several points in kind of our journey in the last 8 years, we had learned how wrong we were with our hypothesis and our assumptions of household behaviors, which kind of fundamentally shifted how we organized our school readiness program or even our ration delivery program. So in the last 18 months, one of the significant insights have been how kind of distribution of ration happens in a household. And one of the key learnings was that we assume that rations delivered to pregnant lactating mothers and children are largely consumed by the intended beneficiaries. But we quickly realized that that was not the case because of livelihood shocks. And our program could not just focus on education and maternal health and had to address the livelihood shocks in the context of the pandemic. Speaking to Natasha's point on really going in with a lens of kind of deep listening and not making assumptions about norms that drive kind of impact and kind of behavior in the last mile. And finally, to Bharat's point, there have been many times where we try to advocate for policy impact, based on kind of our understanding of data from a citizenship space. But many times the leverage has been making the same case from the perspective of the benefits for government officials. Just to cite a quick example, like we were making a case for online lotteries for RT admissions, and for a large point of time, we would advocate for the benefits that families stood to gain in terms of reduced transaction costs. But what really clinched the case was actually when we were able to make the case for increased person hours for government officials who are otherwise to invigilate these lotteries. When we made that case that school principals and vice principals would be saved huge amounts of time if we were to kind of make this algorithm online, fair and open. That was when things went online. So yeah, I definitely resonate with all the 3 points you had mentioned. So before we move to kind of the questions from the audience, so I wanted to kind of pick on the second topic, which was kind of, how do you see the space from a long-term point of view? Natasha started off with making investments with a decadal horizon. So if you were to extend that and, give us ourselves the 25-year horizon, so, what is the imagination from each of your foundations for, India at 100?
We're not going alphabetical this time, Tarun.
You want to get started?
Varad has the most experience in this, so I'm going to let him start.
Well, I can tell you my aspiration. I don't know whether it's an organizational aspiration, but I think the fundamental belief in the power of active citizenship has to be, I would even use the word restored, because again, I go back to the fact that our founding fathers, since we're saying India at 100, had really thought of this topic as something which was foundational to the idea of India. And I think it'll only happen if we, people in this meeting, but also obviously much more broadly, keep innovating and figuring out how to reframe, reimagine that promise. I think on the government side, I think as we discussed, there's a lot to be done on really making Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies function the way they were meant to. And as far as scale goes, there's no bigger opportunity, right? Because in terms of representation, you have lakhs of elected representatives in these bodies across the country, with good representation of women, marginalized groups, etc., etc. So it's a question of activating it. And so I think we need a PRI and ULB 2.2 agenda on that front. I think we also need to learn from the successful models of the last few decades. And again, I mentioned the SHG one because I've seen it closely. I think there are a lot of interesting ways to think about it. And I think the main thing really is that if we all, the community has to be at the center of this movement. And if the entire effort from all sides is about how do we ensure that they remain in the driving seat and have the requisite tools to make those decisions, then I think we can get the flywheel effect to continue moving. And the more we can amplify the stories of success and learnings in the islands of excellence that we have had in India, the better chance that we have. So I think short answer, the at big scale agenda is PRI and ULB 2.0. And then I think there are very large movements from which we can also learn how to make the community a sustainable anchor for this process.
I wanted to sort of just add a little bit around the government piece, sort of before answering your question, Tarun, because I think it's a really fascinating. It's a wicked problem to sort of think about in terms of what creates these overturned windows and when does government really come into play and when does it act and therefore how do you leverage them or how do you create all of that so that you can leverage government and its scale. Some of the work that we've done at a very early stage really looks at this idea of, who are the coalition of actors that create public sentiment that eventually also sort of drives and moves public policy. And part of that, to what Bharat was also saying, evidence is a really big part of that. When there is some amount of, technical expertise that pushes up certain amount of evidence and solutions in the form of evidence, and when they come meet and marry with advocates, whether in the form of media who can take those solutions outwards, or insiders within government or within areas that need that are actually the impediment to that progress. So getting a set of insiders, getting a set of media and advocates outside, getting networks and coalitions to sort of take that as a horizontal, that piece of evidence as a horizontal, eventually it somehow tends to kind of move government a little bit. But I think that because I'm not at all I don't want to be understood as saying that there is a formula to this. I think it's difficult, but I did want to share that because it's something we have thought about. And again, Bharat, offline, it would be really lovely to maybe talk a little bit more about that. But to your point on, what lies in the future, or what would be we at least at the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies hope for, I think really for us everything is about choice and expanding the capability set as well as the choice set that is available to individuals. How we do that again is a non-linear, uneven process, but I think that to be able to enable people to exercise agency, exercise voice, create those conditions for all of that, I think is where we're sort of trying to root our work and see what contribution we can have in that space. And we have the faith that if that happens, if that kind of agency and choice fructifies, then that the kind of spontaneous and organic byproduct of that will be a good society. It will be citizens who are able to operate with resilience and have empathy and sort of care for one another and so on and so forth. So that's where we're hoping to to go. Samir?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually touch upon a lot of points that you guys have been talking about. Because on the time scale, Tarun, we have a very stark choice on what we have picked up. We don't have more than 10 years. End of story, right? There are no 25 years. The 25-year plan looks like a big party, because if we don't solve it in 25 years, we might as well blow it up. That's the stark reality. And none of the other problems that we talk about will exist if we don't figure this out in 10 years, right? It's that was the starting point that led to the creation of this foundation. Individually, me and a lot of people on the team actually really believe this. We're not just kidding about this. Why it needs to, and because you have so little time, you cannot, you can't pussyfoot around it. You can't work at the edges. You can't work at the fringes. It better really, really, really quickly become everybody's problem, right? Which means it has to be solved by everybody simultaneously, right? It doesn't matter, what you're fixing. If you're fixing farmers' incomes and livelihoods without accounting for the ecology, you're dead in water 5 years from now. You're going to run out of groundwater. You already have dead soils. You have you're seeing what the rats are doing in Australia. I mean, it's so honestly, yes, Al Gore did a good movie, but what's happening in life now, the news is far scarier than that. So the messaging is starting to, on the downsides, is starting to turn. Now the messaging on the hope, on what's possible, what are the little successes, what are the ideas, stories, methods from the last few decades. How do you create playbooks? How do you replicate it? How do you get everybody to be a change maker as quickly as possible, right? Fundamental to that is what I mentioned earlier about people being able to see the third, fourth, 27th order impact of the change they make, because that's something that's seriously difficult. As human beings, we are almost wired to not recognize anything beyond, in seriously intellectual cases, maybe the second order impact of things. Right? It just eludes us. As governments, we cannot see that. As individuals, we cannot see that. So those are the outstanding problems. But finally, it has to be like a forest of ideas. What works in Coorg is not going to work in Meghalaya, is not going to work in Chhattisgarh. There has to be local adaptation and adoption of ideas. There have to be 1,000 different ideas working on it. You have to allow for evolution, which means you cannot go in with top-down approaches. And this is something we are fundamentally asking everybody we are working with. When I say working with, I don't necessarily mean funding, because we are also trying to create a network of collaborations. Sometimes just like a timely connect between two things is all you need to solve a problem. So it's not optional for us to look at it as a community up view, right? And that involves everybody in a village. It involves the panchayat. It involves the elected reps. It involves policy. It involves everybody out there. So if this doesn't happen, and this doesn't happen quickly enough, right? We're looking at a very serious situation in 5 years from now. I don't think we have the luxury to look at it any differently. So yeah, what can we do? So by the way, the women's self-help group has come up everywhere. I think that's the best, quickest, most powerful way of creating change everywhere. And this is something we just heard from everybody and we're convinced about as well. So this is it's really nice. We have a few points of consensus and a few goals. But I wish we had these goals economically, ecologically. How do you? There are certain things we cannot yet mention in public, right? We cannot mention the idea of degrowth, for instance. So you have to pussyfoot around it and call it localization and talk about different things. We do not realize the costs that go with it. We count the costs on the negative side, but we do not count the costs on the positive sides, right? So the math is broken, the messaging is broken, and we really need a lot of solutions coming on it on all of these ground up, not just thought through in Bangalore and then translated poorly into local contexts, and they never translate well. Is something we have also found. So, sorry, I was a little all over the map, but I hope I'm able to communicate the urgency of this. And we just cannot do this without serious civic engagement. Not civic engagement. We cannot do this without people owning this as their own problem. It's not our solutions. It's not. We can merely be enablers to this. And I think the sooner we realize this, the more sustainable the solutions will be. So, yeah.
Thank you, Samir, for closing that round on a really passionate plea for the urgency with which we need to act on climate resilience, and especially how the clock is ticking. So we could use the last 10-15 minutes for the questions that have come up from our audience. So I'll take one by one and direct them to one of you, based on my understanding of who would be best suited to answer. But please feel free to chip in. The first question is from Nikhil. His question is: do you see a glass ceiling for the active citizenship work that is grounded or driven by bazaar? So in terms of philanthropic investment by funders, what's the role of Sarkar, especially if regulatory pressures, as we see with FCRA, change of rules, will that kind of have a kind of constraining effect on the space itself? Bharat, you want to take a shot at it, given your understanding of interaction with government? How could civil society actors build more trust in the current regulatory environment? What could we do to create more enabling conditions in the regulatory environment?
Yeah, look, my view on this is that, one thing which I said earlier, which is, our goal should be to strengthen the community organizations, right? And then the flywheel effect will happen. There's an interesting framework on this, where you can argue that there are two routes to accountability to citizens that a state has. There's a long route, which is through elections, and then you have elected representatives, and then you serve the interests of people. And then there's a short route, which is getting the service delivery functionaries to be directly accountable to people, right? So I think a lot of our effort can be focused on the short route to accountability. The other thing I would just say is that, there are many avenues of collaboration with government on this agenda. We should not assume an adversarial relationship on this agenda, because I think there's a lot of unlock which can happen, right? We talked about the Panchayati Raj a few times today. That I think is the biggest at-scale intervention for active, and that is fully, it's a national agenda, and we need to keep supporting it. The second, we talked about examples like the District Mineral Fund, which again is a government agenda, tons of money around it. We need to help unlock it. And then the third, I will give you another example, which is, and this probably links to another question in the chat, which is putting information data out there can also be done with government partnership. One of the things we are doing as an organization right now is supporting the setup of something called a National Data Analytics Platform, which is being anchored by the Niti Aayog. The idea is that, the government produces tons of data across ministries, across states, et cetera, et cetera. Technically, a lot of that is meant to be in the public domain, but currently it lies in silos and Excel sheets and so on and so forth. So it's not particularly useful if you want to either inform policy making or even just bring transparency and accountability out there, right? So the effort is to try and put it put all that data in a common data schema on a common platform so that it's available to informed citizens, researchers, journalists, etc., to provide that transparency and drive citizen-centric actions. Now, again, that is another example where it's a public-private philanthropic partnership where this is being done through a collaboration of not just us but many other experts outside and inside government. So I think just wanted to emphasize that there are lots of spaces and real examples of where governments can be an active partner, collaborator in the active citizenship agenda, and we are still only scratching the surface as far as that is concerned.
Thank you, Bharat. I echo with you on that, and that's been our experience. Trying to work as a bridge between citizens trying to access their rights and governments trying to build capacity to deliver rights in the space of education, food security, and livelihoods. Very much resonate with what you shared. Natasha, do you want to add any examples from RNP Portfolio, especially on providing access to timely public information, which has kind of led to stronger civic engagement?
Yeah, I mean, one of course is the work that you talked about, Tarun, your own work. But I think we have organizations like Civis, for instance, which has been working in trying to get much more participation from citizens and allowing them to give inputs into draft legislation, and it's been quite interesting to see the engagement from citizens online, where the level of trust is also much greater in terms of going through an organization like Civis and feeling like they're being heard a lot better. So there are organizations like Civis. We also had Nyaya in the session before us, which is trying to again build a bridge between the legal space as well as individuals trying to understand the law and also trying to articulate their needs. And there is, of course, an offline component to some of these things. So in both Civis and Nyaya's case, what's interesting is how there is the online is being paired with the offline to kind of complete that ecosystem. There's another instance if we look at the work of Jhatka as well. So Jhatka sort of is trying to create a lot of, Jhatka is trying to sort of not be the actor and be more of the glue, where it's bringing a lot of information and experts in touch with citizens who might have a certain passion for an issue. They're trying to raise concerns, and in the process of that work, they're doing a lot of work with data on pollution and raising some of those energies. And I think that it's a really great pairing, on the kind of government data, which is collected by government, and public data, which is actually provided and crowdsourced by people. So I think there's an interesting marriage to be talked of there as well, in terms of how does the data that government collect become a lot more crowdsourced, of course, authenticated, valuable, and then downstreamed as well to the individuals who then can make meaning with that data. And also, so accountability flows both ways in some sense. It's very aspirational, yes. I think we're sort of at this point, the struggle really is in even having good government data. But I think that there is something to be thought of in terms of expanding the imagination on what data in this space could look like as well.
Thank you, Natasha. Samit, there's a question on technology I thought you'd be best placed to respond to. How do you think of funding digital commons, and kind of what's the best route of funding for a digital commons?
The best route we are still figuring out, to be honest. We are looking at various models that exist today. The need for not just digital commons, like Natasha was saying, it has to go downstream as well, because how does it? One very important component is how does it reach the last change maker in the village, right? Who's not necessarily looking at a Wikipedia-like interface or a search engine all the time, right? So there's also that. But yeah, essentially we need to put out all the great learnings. We need to create playbooks from everywhere, and actionable playbooks. So we are actually committed to investing into that. We are already started doing that. We have to make it look like the mainstream, is what I keep saying, right? I mean, it's the combined set of actors, actions, even outcomes to a certain extent that have already happened, is actually much larger than the Bangalore startup ecosystem, for instance. But it feels much smaller because it doesn't appear like the mainstream. There's almost like a very hard desire to appear like this amazing fringe, if you understand what I mean, right? So, what does it have? There are careers in it, jobs in it. There is funding in it. There is uh, knowledge systems that are available to everybody at various levels. There are physical and online events like this that happen that also bring in a wider diversity of actors into the same space. So all of this will need a lot of different platforms. So we are insisting, and I think Natasha's team is also doing that, and we've learned from them that everything that needs to happen in the public in a public commons way, whether it's open source software. We are trying to encourage uh, people we are partnering with to bring their software out into open source, right? And we're trying to work with FOSS United to see if we can get that funded, right? If we can find volunteers to do that. We would love to actually partner on the analytics platform that you're creating, Bharat, right? So what's also required to develop now is the ability to work with sparse data, because you're not going to have something that fits a common schema. You're not going to have rich data everywhere equally. There's one organization which has actually mapped 500 different villages for soil carbon and similar attributes. Right? You may not have it everywhere else, but that's not good enough reason to not start. Right. So similarly for water assessment, we are trying to create the idea of mapping ecological wealth for all the 750 bioregions of India, because you cannot create strong localized economies unless you understand what your wealth is. People who understand their wealth can engage with it and can think of solutions around it. So all of this needs to be captured. So I think a lot more is needed. We are trying to find ways to keep it even outside Rain Matter in a completely public commons kind of way. We need to figure out what consortiums can be created and how it can be truly open. Still early days, but I think a lot needs to be done.
Tarun, if I can just add something on that,
Sure,
one way we've been thinking about this digital commons piece and links to funding is that if you think about digital commons and you use a Bangalore analogy, if you think of a stack,
Yeah,
it's the technology layer, right? But there are two other equally important layers. There's the governance layer,
yeah,
and there's the community engagement layer. And I would argue that today India is like a world leader in terms of thinking about the technology layer. We have some of the most impressive things, starting out with Aadhaar, India Stack, now a very interesting place like the National Digital Health Mission,
yeah,
and the, Diksha, and all of these other things, right? So I think they're fabulous stuff. But we have work to do on both the governance layer and the community engagement layer.
yeah,
Governance layer are the rules of the game, the institutional ownership, the accountability,
yeah,
the issues of data privacy.
yeah,
All of these things I would put in the governance layer. And the community engagement layer, of course, very familiar to people in this group, but things like public consultation, making sure that processes are followed when you're doing these, but also building a community of innovators who will build on
Yes.
top of digital commons, which
Yes.
actually often gets ignored if you take a tech first lens.
yeah, yeah,
So really what we've been saying is funders, philanthropic funders can come in and support the strengthening of the
Yeah.
governance and the community engagement layers, because on the technology layer of digital commons, the story is already shaping up to be quite good.
So out here in Bangalore, we have instances of both happening. The FOSS community does it a certain way, the free and open source community, the folks at OpenStreetMaps, and there are a bunch of open data platforms who have a certain view of how community rules work, and they have some precedents as well. On the engagement side, I think it's got to be ground up. So what we're trying to do is, if something has to go open source, are there 3 more adopters for it right off the bat? So you're taking a slightly product management approach to this. I think a deeper, wider conversation on this is very, very necessary, and would love to connect with you on that, Bharat.
Thank you, Samir and Bharat, for that. So I'll take one last question. I'll take kind of the liberty of the facilitator veto to iterate it a little bit. So now Nick's second question is around the relationship between state and capital. He's asking a specific example of, is it possible to imagine private capital in aiding civic engagement and political participation? Bharat, to your point around imagining a 2.0 version of urban local body participation. So that is coming to mind as traditionally kind of the levels of voter turnout are kind of low relative to other voter turnouts in General Assembly and state elections. So can we one broader question is, for each of you, like what is your vision to kind of, liberalize some of the, conditions of how, capital is invested in the active citizenship space, and there are kind of certain restraints around where it can be invested, not invested. Like in US, for example, Get Out to Vote is a fairly, popular, space of investment. So yeah, that was one. And secondly, very specifically to some of the visions that you had shared, like say, if you had to imagine a 2.0 vision for urban local bodies, what is the scope for capital in investing in, promoting 72nd and 73rd, amendments or implementation of 72nd and 73rd amendments?
Natasha, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, Tarun, but I think in terms of local governance, our thinking around local governance and perhaps capitalization of that really lies in a lot of sort of external factors. For instance, what is the level of decentralization, what is the level of funds available. I think here again we sort of lead from the more kind of community angle in terms of there has to be problem solving at a very hyper local level. There have to be networks and coalitions of both information as well as solutions that are happening very dynamically. I think the funding on this side, I think perhaps, I'm circling back to what I said earlier, is that we have realized that just kind of seeding the space and allowing actions to just keep happening is somewhere that is the approach that we're taking, which is, that things will eventually spontaneously come together at some point, but it's really important to kind of nurture the actions and the interactions as they're happening. So that, and that's there at the local level. I wouldn't necessarily comment on, the 76th Amendment. I think that issue is actually complicated because there is the whole element of sort of district administration that comes into the ability for the Panchayati Raj system to be empowered, and it's really, I'm not the expert on that at all. Having said, I think that at the kind of at the village level, the approach there as well in some of the partnerships that we have, for instance, is around empowerment, and we feel that empowerment as a pathway for emergent political leadership is a good way to go. We have seen that in some of our programs as well, that once you empower a group of people, a certain percentage of them do assert themselves and sort of realize realize their potential politically, and perhaps that's. And the third and last thing I just want to quickly say is around ensuring diversity. So when it comes to sort of any kind of funding or any kind of leverage that all of us want to have, I think collaboration, going in it together. So diversity on the funding side, diversity on the implementation side is really important. But yeah.
What you wanted to come?
Yeah. No, I think I also not fully understood the question, but let me just say two things. One is that the way we look at the funding on this space is not different from the funding in other spaces, which is to say we are looking for bold entrepreneurs who are trying to help solve the problem, right? So in the active citizenship, we're looking for bold, like in our tech for impact for-profit investing, we look for bold entrepreneurs. And similarly, we're looking for bold entrepreneurs who are trying to solve the problem of citizen engagement. And there are some exemplars in our country, right? There's Janagraha, there is a Foundation for Ecological Security. I would argue even e-government foundation would fall in that category, even though they take a tech lens and so on. So I think that is very, very critical to the way one should think about deploying capital on this agenda. The second thing I would say, specifically on the for-profit investments in this space, I would say that is a fledgling space. I think a lot of efforts have been made in the past, but it's a lot of complexities around ability and willingness to pay and so on and so forth. There have been efforts around, I think, incubators around civic tech and so on, which have met with limited success so far. But again, that's an area that we are very interested to continue supporting. There's an entity within IIM Ahmedabad called CIIE, Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, where we have recently supported a program to fund entrepreneurship in 3 spaces which are under-invested, which are property tech, legal tech, and civic tech. And the idea really is that recognizing there aren't any ready to invest for-profit opportunities in these spaces, what are the set of things that entrepreneurs would need to make them, investable in the conventional sense operations in the near future?
Thanks for it. That makes sense. We're at the hour mark, so we'll quickly bring this to a close with quick word of advice that you have for bold founders and entrepreneurs out there. So if you could get a bite from each one of you, what do you have what is your advice for funders and aspiring social entrepreneurs out there? Samir, maybe you want to get us started.
What we've been asking for is folks to be a little audacious. We can't afford to tinker at the edges anymore. We are taking the focus away from small project goals to directional goals and longer term goals. I mean, not going to put a time frame to it. So we're trying to figure out how do we start measuring how the needle is moved rather than how the project goals are achieved. Right. So people can think audaciously, experiment, pivot quickly, leave space for ground up discovery of solutions and so on and so forth. So we would like to see more of it. I do understand that it's not the habit by and large, and there is it's not how things are measured across the space. So we might be just complicating their lives for now, but what the hell.
Natasha?
Yeah, I think for us, I think what's really valuable is to partner with people who understand very clearly the angle with which they're addressing an issue, but also recognize that there is a larger system dynamic and are interested and curious to understand the larger systemic vectors that come into place. So I think that kind of, I suppose, curiosity is what we really sort of hope people will hold on to.
Since I have the last word, 3 quick things. 1, be bold. I think Samir has already talked about that. Time for, and I think a lot of funders look for that, I think, as both Samir and Natasha said. Second is think hard about positioning and storytelling. I think the people in this space have a lot of work to do on that. We said this is a difficult space as far as that is concerned. And third, demonstrate leverage, right? Either around how you're going to leverage the energy of communities to solve the problem, or how are you going to leverage the government system to help solve the problem. I think people, funders especially, appreciate you bringing that lens into that discussion. So boldness, storytelling, and leverage would be my three takeaways.
Awesome. On that note, I had a great time learning and listening from all of you. I hope kind of the audience had a great time as well. I hope we don't need this discussion in 25 years from now. And then, like Samir said, maybe in 10 years from now, we can convene back to kind of celebrate some of the successes we achieve in the next decade of motivated active citizenship. But thanks a lot. This was very personally enriching. Back to you, Yash.
Thank you so much to all the guests for such an insightful discussion. I think this was an amazing session to close out the day for the Resilient Societies track. However, we will be back tomorrow at 11 a.m. with the session Uncommon Ground, where our speakers will try to discuss paths towards greater coexistence between a strong society and a strong state. Finally, we close out the Resilient Societies track tomorrow with our last session, Charcha Pe Charcha, at 12 p.m., which is going to be a playful and dynamic conversation between the founders in the Rohini Nilekali Philanthropies Active Citizenship Portfolio. So do tune in tomorrow as well. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being with us today. We hope to see you again tomorrow and have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye
Bye.
bye. Thank you.